Eastern Colorado, July 11, 1869. At the head of a small ravine situated on the open, rolling plains, a young Cheyenne warrior named Wolf with Plenty of Hair stands defiantly, ready to receive the oncoming charge of U.S. Army scouts and soldiers coming at him. With his eyes fixed sternly on the charging Americans, he lets loose a blue sash that is tied to his waist. The sash falls to the dirt, and he drives a long, crooked lance through it, tethering himself to the ground. He is a member of the Cheyenne warrior society known as the Dog Soldiers, and this is his signal to the enemy that he is ready to fight to the death. His leader, a legendary Cheyenne chief named Tall Bull, stands not far away, himself making ready to defend his wife and sister. They have been ambushed by these soldiers and driven from their village. Where only minutes before most of the Cheyenne had been enjoying their midday meal, their village is now a veritable house of horrors, with dead and dying warriors strewn about the ground and terrified women and children being taken prisoner by the army. Tall Bull has ordered the survivors into this ravine, where he and his warriors plan to fight to the last man in order to protect their families. On the American side, Major General Eugene Carr leads a contingent of U.S. Army soldiers and scouts, including a young William Buffalo Bill Cody, as all of them race towards the ravine. Within a matter of moments, their attack smashes into the Cheyenne line, and young Wolf with Plenty of Hair prepares to make his last stand. Dust and screams now fill the air as every soldier and scout seeks to engage and to kill any Cheyenne warrior that they can. This scene is one of utter chaos and carnage, with vicious hand-to-hand fighting unfolding within the cramped confines of the ravine. Warrior after warrior falls as they fight to the death, with many of their wives and children only a few yards away. But this ambush, though brutal, is by no means random. It is the result of a war that has been escalating for many years between the encroaching American settlers of Colorado and the Cheyenne. In the previous 5 years, the Cheyenne, incensed at the events of 1864's Sand Creek Massacre, in which a large village of Cheyenne, presumably on peaceable terms with the United States, had been ambushed by U.S. Army troops under the command of Colonel John Chivington. Men, women, and children alike had been callously cut down in what would come to be known as one of the darkest chapters in the entire history of the Old West. This event had led to the last 5 years being among the bloodiest in Colorado history, as the Cheyenne have sought their vengeance against any of those they see as responsible for the massacre. For any American seeking to settle on its expansive prairies, eastern Colorado has proven to be a very dangerous place. But the events of the prior few weeks have proven uniquely violent even by the standards of the Colorado frontier. It had begun on Sunday, May 30th, at the home of Michael Haley, located about a quarter-mile north of the Saline River. Here, 19-year-old Eli Ziegler and his brother-in-law, John Alverson, had stopped on their journey to visit a nearby homestead so that they could visit Eli's sister, Susanna Alderdice, and her 4 young children. Susanna's husband, Thomas, had been away on business and had left his young family to stay in the cabin while he was gone. Michael Haley, the owner of the cabin, had taken his family to nearby Fort Harker, believing that Cheyenne raids upon this settlement were imminent. Also staying at the Haley home was Bridget Kine and her 2-month-old daughter, Catherine. Mrs. Kine's husband had also been away on the same business trip and left his young family here in case the Cheyenne should attack. As Eli and John Alverson had finished visiting, Eli bade his sister and young nieces and nephews farewell, before he and Alverson had loaded up into the buckboard wagon and headed off to survey the homestead site. The young men had followed Spillman Creek to nearby Lost Creek, and then had made their way north until hitting the crossing site at Trail Creek. It was here that Eli Ziegler had first noticed a group of a few dozen horsemen several hundred yards away. He had pointed them out to Alverson, noting that he believed them to be a group of U.S. Army cavalrymen, but Alverson had staunchly disagreed, believing them instead to be a group of Cheyenne. In his later account, Ziegler would recall that, quote, "The sun glistened on their guns so plain that I still thought that they were soldiers, but John would not have it that way, and I had about made up my mind that they were," end quote. They had continued on arguing and becoming increasingly nervous. Then, they saw the group split into two, with half of the group suddenly riding away. The group who had remained then charged directly towards Alverson and Ziegler. Now, it was readily apparent to both of them that this group was in fact Cheyenne. And as the Cheyenne approached, they knew it was too late to try to escape. Still, Ziegler had quickly turned the wagon around and made a desperate bid to outrun the oncoming warriors. His account of the attack continues, quote, "We got to the creek. The Indians were close behind us. I looked across the creek and thought there was a little bank on the other side that would protect us some. So I drove across, but John misunderstood me and jumped into the creek as I drove up the bank. John ran along the bank under the side that I was on as the Indians were coming across the creek within a few yards of us, shooting and yelling. John was calling for me to get out of the wagon. When I got to that little bank, I stopped the horses. Seeing that nothing more could be done to save the team, and that we must defend ourselves, I dropped the lines, grabbed my gun, and jumped out on the off side of the wagon. Reaching into the wagon for my cartridges, I could only get one box, containing about 20 rounds. While I was getting the cartridges, the Indians were closing in all around. One of them rode up and picked up the lines that I had just laid down, and he held the horses. The Indians were shooting this entire time. John was calling for me to get under the bank. Just then, an Indian darted right up close to the wagon, and I thought that I would let him have it. But before I could cover him with my gun, he jumped off his pony and onto the opposite side of the wagon. John was still begging for me to jump over the bank, and I had made up my mind to. But as I stepped out of the wagon, I looked toward the rear and behind the wagon, and I saw 3 Indians standing about 4 rods away, having me covered with their guns. I had no time for a shot, so I made a spring for the creek bank, but I slipped and fell just as they fired. I think they shot over me. I kept going on my hands and knees over to the bank, and then we saw a log, and we ran to that, thinking that it might protect us. Here, the 2 men had managed to hide until late afternoon. Meanwhile, the Cheyenne had left, heading to meet the other half of their war party who had headed north. This second half of their group was a band of dog soldiers under the leadership of the legendary Tall Bull. They had followed Spillman Creek, where they had first encountered a local Danish immigrant couple named Erskine and Stein Lauritsen. The couple had been out for a peaceful Sunday stroll along the creek when Tall Bull and his dog soldiers had suddenly appeared. The unfortunate couple was cut down within minutes, their bodies left lying near the creek where they had fallen. At around 2 p.m., they had then attacked George and Maria Weichel, as well as their neighbor Fred Meigerhoff, all 3 of whom were also out on a Sunday stroll along the creek. The 2 men in George Weichel and Fred Meigerhoff had been armed, and both had put up a vicious fight against the Cheyenne, firing and reloading while covering for the escape of Maria Weichel. In a 3-mile running fight, the trio managed to make their way down to Spillman Creek, heading southeast. Finally, though, the 2 men had run out of ammunition, and in what must have been a horrific scene, they were both cut down by Tall Bull and his men. Then, Maria Weichel had been swiftly lifted onto the back of a dog soldier's horse, after which the warriors rode away from the site of the killings. However, Weichel's ordeal had only begun. A few yards away, the dog soldiers stopped in order to practice their long-held ritual of Noha Wastan, or staking to the prairie, in which the unfortunate victim was repeatedly assaulted via all manner of violations. Not far from here, the group of Cheyenne warriors who had first attacked Eli Ziegler and John Alverson now struck the home of Michael Haley. At first sight of the approaching warriors, the children were gathered inside the Haley home, as the warriors first focused their attention on the corrals, taking custody of all of the horses that they could. Believing that they were trapped in the house with no hope of escape, Susanna Alderdice had taken her 4 children, with her youngest in her arms and made a break for the Saline River. Bridget Kine had quickly followed suit, grabbing her daughter and running for the banks of the river. And, in a terrifying, painstaking effort, the two pregnant women had ushered their young children towards the water. It had, in fact, seemed to both women that they might actually be able to make it to the river undetected by the Cheyenne, but just as they neared the banks, they were spotted. Bridget Kine, still clutching her infant child to her chest, had plunged over the steep banks of the river and managed to hide under an overhang, praying that her child did not cry out. Susanna Alderdice and her children, however, would not be so fortunate. Moments after being spotted, the Cheyenne had charged towards her and her children. Seeing that they were surrounded, Susanna had fallen to the ground, protecting her 8-month-old as best she could, but her remaining 3 sons were all summarily struck down by Cheyenne arrows. The horrified young mother, having just witnessed all but one of her children fall victim to the Cheyenne, was then scooped up and tied to the back of a horse, still clutching her youngest child. As this terrifying scene unfolded, a pair of younger Cheyenne, one of them a mere teenager, had split off from the 2 main groups, looking to find their own opportunities for looting and glory. They happened upon 2 local teenaged boys named Arthur Schmutz and John Strange, who were spending their afternoon harvesting turnips. In an unnerving scene, the 2 Cheyenne had approached the boys under overtures of peace, stating that they were friendly Pawnee scouts. Unsure of exactly what was happening, Schmutz and Strange had remained affable, even allowing the older Cheyenne to touch them on the shoulders with his spear in what they believed to be a sign of peace. But immediately after this, the teenage Cheyenne had ridden up to John Strange and suddenly pulled his war club, then bashed it into the unfortunate Strange's head with such force that the handle broke. Strange had managed to cry out, "Oh Lord!" before collapsing dead. Stunned at what he had just witnessed, Schmutz was momentarily frozen. In this moment, the teenaged Cheyenne had drawn his bow and quickly loosed an arrow that hit Schmutz in the chest. However, the wound was not mortal, and Schmutz had then bolted into a full sprint and attempted to outrun his attackers. The young Cheyenne warrior then fired another arrow, this one striking Schmutz in the back. But still, he ran on. Schmutz, with arrows protruding from his torso, sprinted all the way to Strange's family homestead, crying out that the Cheyenne were attacking. Hearing this, the younger brothers of the slain John Strange, Riley and Marion Strange, grabbed their guns and ran to his aid, providing covering fire as Schmutz reached their cabin. The Cheyenne had abandoned their chase as the injured boy collapsed inside the cabin, first attempting to drive off the Strange family horses before finally disappearing into the open landscape. The family had then huddled inside their cabin, attempting to care for Arthur Schmutz, who had lost a great deal of blood, while simultaneously coming to grips with the fact that their son and brother John had been slain, and preparing for another imminent Cheyenne attack. As all of this unfolded, one of the women, who remains unnamed in historical accounts, cried out that a large band of horsemen were heading their way from the south, and that she believed them to be Cheyenne. And, for a few fleeting moments, all among them feared that they would soon be overrun by a large force of warriors. But it turned out that this was in fact a cavalry company heading to nearby Fort Harker. Meanwhile, word had spread through the nearby homesteads that Tall Bull and his dog soldiers had ravaged the area, and by late afternoon, several local ranchers had gathered at the cabin of Lon Schermerhorn to assemble a search party for the Cheyenne captives. But just before dusk, the men inside the cabin suddenly heard the cries of a panicked woman coming from the river. It was Bridget Kine, who had miraculously managed to escape by hiding under the riverbank and was now making her way towards the cabin, still clutching her child to her chest. The mother and child were cared for as the rescue party listened intently to her story and made plans for their mission the next day. The next morning, the rescue party headed out early. And later on the same morning, Eli Ziegler and John Alverson staggered into the camp of the Army's 7th Cavalry, located not far from Bullfoot Creek, a small tributary of the Saline River, having traveled all through the night after losing their wagon and surviving the dog soldiers' attack. They reported the Cheyenne attacks of the previous day to the commanding officer, Lieutenant Edward Law. But Law informed the two men that he had been charged with pursuing another band of Cheyenne who had been raiding in the area, and thus he could not divert his mission until he received official orders from his commanding officer at Fort Harker. Eli Ziegler, clearly aghast with the lieutenant's lack of action, described his feeling on the matter in his later account. Quote, "We reported to the officer what we had seen, and we told him what we had heard that night, out on the Saline River bottom, and of all the fire arrows we had seen just a little above the Bigfoot. I begged him to saddle up at once, to furnish me a horse, and I would lead them right to the Indians' camp, where I thought we could catch them if we moved at once and moved quickly. He replied, 'I cannot move any further until I get orders to do so. The Indians were in the settlements over the river yesterday afternoon, but I do not know how much damage they could have done.' He said that he had sent a dispatch to Fort Harker for orders and that he would wait until he received an answer. We were disgusted with his reply. We drank a cup of coffee, ate a hardtack, and started back home, keeping on the south side of the river." End quote. As Ziegler and Alverson made their way back home, dejected and dreading what they would find upon their return, the search party that had gathered at Schermerhorn's ranch had made their way to the site of Haley's cabin, in a wagon which they intended to use to carry the dead back for burial. Following the trail of gore that stretched along the river, they were greeted with the sight of utter devastation that they had expected to find. Bodies lie strewn about the ground, seemingly all of them still in death. First, they came upon the body of John Strange. The unfortunate young man was placed into the wagon in order to be returned to his family. They then came upon the bodies of Erskild and Stein Lauritsen, the Danish immigrant couple who had been shot and killed while on their peaceful Sunday stroll. With no family to be returned to, they were buried where they had fallen. Next, the bodies of George Weichel and Fred Meigerhoff were found, and also buried where they had fallen. But, incredibly, they found 4-year-old Willis Alderdice was actually still alive. The search party then immediately sent out a messenger, one J.J. Pete, to the camp of the 7th Cavalry to request help from the camp surgeon. But, unbelievably and inexplicably, the camp surgeon, whose name has been lost to history, refused to treat Willis Alderdice's wounds. In his recounting of his dealings with the camp surgeon, Pete angrily recalled that, quote, "I have met many Army officers and found them to be honorable men and grand comrades. This one was in the shape of a man, but it ended there." End quote. But despite the cowardly, callous nature of the surgeon, Willis Alderdice actually managed to survive, and even endured the extraction of one of the arrows in a harrowing ordeal carried out by 2 of the local men tending to him. As all of this unfolded, Thomas Alderdice and John Strange, the patriarchs of the Alderdice and Strange families, were on their way back to their homesteads after completing their business trip in Junction City, Kansas. They had been totally unaware of the events that had taken place until a rider sent out from the party assembled at the Schermerhorn Ranch had come to meet them. The rider had informed them of the attack, and they had all raced back to the settlements. Upon arriving back, they were ushered to the home of Marshall Hendrickson, a cousin to the Strange family. Here, it was Henderson who was given the unenviable task of informing Thomas Alderdice and John Strange of exactly what had unfolded. Recounting the events many years later, Hendrickson recalled that he could only muster up a brutally honest explanation of the situation to the 2 men. "Strange," he said, "your boy is killed. Alderdice, your family is all killed or captured." Strange was taken to view the body of his unfortunate son, while Alderdice was taken to be with his stepson Willis before himself viewing the bodies of his deceased son Frank and stepson John. As the young Willis Alderdice, still in great pain, lie recovering inside the Hendrickson cabin, Thomas Alderdice attended to the funeral of John and Frank. Alderdice had spent the previous evening both attending to Willis and assisting in building the coffins, but once the funeral was complete, he had taken to the trail of the Cheyenne, intent on saving his wife and his remaining child. He had served as a scout under Colonel Forsyth with the U.S. Army, who had combated the Cheyenne years before, and now, seeing the attitude of the local military, he decided that his only real chance of finding his family would be to do it himself. On June 1st, 2 days after Tall Bull and his warriors had attacked his family, Thomas Alderdice ventured out onto the plains in search of his wife, his child, and the Cheyenne. In his own account of his travels, written 3 weeks later on June 21st, Alderdice, showing his expertise as an experienced scout, meticulously recounted the direction and the mileage of his route as he attempted to find the Cheyenne. Quoting from his journals, "I traveled from the Saline River 3 miles east of Spillman Creek, then headed north by northwest, striking the north branch of Salt Creek, distance 12 miles. Then I traveled west by north, up the north branch of the Salt Creek, before striking Spillman Creek about a half a mile above the main fork, distance 9 miles. Traveled up West Fork of Spillman to head of creek, traveling west by northwest, then crossed to Wolf Creek, striking the East Fork, then went up East Fork about 4 miles, crossed to West Fork." End quote. After this arduous trek, Alderdice finally located the Cheyenne Trail. He followed this north until he spotted 3 Cheyenne who were out hunting. Again, quoting from Alderdice's account, "I supposed a large camp above, and secreted myself in a ravine to watch their movements. I could see nothing but Indians going out and returning to the creek. I returned back to the settlement for help." Alderdice had then made the equally arduous trip to return to the settlement, one that took him several days to complete. But to his dismay, by the time he returned, Lieutenant Law and the 7th Cavalry had moved out of the area. This was a devastating blow, as Alderdice had been counting on requesting immediate military assistance and knew that time was of the essence. But he remained undaunted, leaving the settlement for Fort Harker, where he was certain he would be able to find immediate assistance. He arrived on June 19th, now a full 18 days after the killing and capture of his children and wife, and he requested a meeting with the commander of the U.S. Department of the Missouri, General John Schofield. But here, too, Alderdice was left disappointed, as he was outright denied any meeting with the commanding officer. However, he was able to secure a brief meeting with one General George Armstrong Custer, who listened intently to Alderdice's horrifying story before assuring the distraught husband and father that he would present his story directly to his commanding officers. Still, Custer warned him that he did not know if it would produce any effect. But in a fortuitous turn for Alderdice, a local newspaper, the Leavenworth Daily Commercial, would run a story on his plight the following day, conveying not only a profound sympathy for his heart-wrenching situation, but a profound disgust with the conduct of the military officials who had denied to help him. The article noted that there are times when what is known as red tape may be excusable in military as it is in other matters. There are times, however, when its observance in military matters is likely to prove productive of a great wrong. A case in point was reported to us yesterday. A gentleman whose wife and youngest child, together with a young Swede girl, had been captured by Indians, and whose other child had been killed, arrived in this city Friday afternoon for the purpose of securing military aid. The gentleman, terribly grieved at his loss and at the threatened and probable fate of the captured, would not rest until he made an effort to have done all that was possible for their relief. But he was refused an audience until about 9 o'clock the following morning. The The distress of the gentleman in question at his failure to get an audience and an order for troops was very great. With two helpless women in the hands of these red devils, the one a wife with a young child, who will wonder that the man was nearly distracted on being refused an audience on Friday afternoon? This level of bad press led to General Schofield finally granting a meeting to Alderdice on June 21st. But ultimately, the meeting was to little effect, with Alderdice only able to leave a written description of his wife and child with Schofield. For his part, the general contended that the Cheyenne had almost certainly already left the area, and it would be a risky move for him to expend an entire company in search of native forces who were no longer there. Schofield offered that he could send a telegram to the commander of nearby Fort Supply, head of the Department of the Platte, General C.C. Augur. But for the time being, Schofield told Alderdice that this was all that he could do. And so, Alderdice had again left the gates of a frontier fort, dejected and nearly overwhelmed with equal parts fear and grief, which seemed to alternately wash over him as he made his way back to the Cheyenne camp. When he arrived back at the location of the camp, General Schofield's presumption that the Cheyenne had left the area was proven correct, as all that Alderdice found were the remains of the camp. Still, he took the opportunity to sift through its remains, hoping to find any kind of clue that might lead him to his captured loved ones. As he moved from one circle of flattened prairie grass to another, each one the former site of a Cheyenne lodge, he finally assumed that there was nothing to be found. Then, just as he was about to give up his search, he noticed something hanging from the branches of a nearby tree. Walking over to the tree, he finally realized that what he saw was his missing daughter, who had been dispatched by the Cheyenne and left in the tree. Sick with grief, Alderdice had dug a grave in the hard prairie ground and laid her to rest, all while keeping a watchful eye out for any lingering Cheyenne warriors. For Thomas Alderdice, it now seemed that all hope was lost. But back at Fort Supply, General Augur had received the telegram informing him of Alderdice's plight and had sent a courier out to inform Major General Eugene Carr that he should immediately take to the trail of the Cheyenne and attempt to recover the missing captives. Carr was already out on the plains, and when he received the message, he had quickly assembled his men and his Pawnee scouts and moved out in search of the Cheyenne's trail. Among his scouts, most of whom were Pawnee, is one William F. Cody, otherwise known as Buffalo Bill, a legendary frontiersman and one of the most skilled scouts and trackers in the entirety of the U.S. Army. On July 11th, nearly 6 weeks after the Cheyenne had taken the Alderdice family, Carr and his men finally located the Cheyenne camp and made their attack about noon. This attack would take Tall Bull and the rest of the village completely by surprise, utterly devastating the unsuspecting Cheyenne. Seeing no hope of defending themselves from the center of the village, Tall Bull and several of the other dog soldiers had moved their families into this small ravine, where he and Wolf with Plenty of Hair now stand, ready to fight to the death. Now, Major General Carr, Buffalo Bill Cody, and the rest of the men slam into the Cheyenne lines, first cutting down the young Wolf with Plenty of Hair where he stands. Then, a vicious close-quarters fight unfolds, all while Thomas Alderdice desperately searches the village for his missing wife, Susanna. This terrible scene, known to history as the Battle of Summit Springs, will go on to be one of the most ruthless, vicious battles in the history of the Old West. In Part 2 of this episode, we will see the death of Tall Bull, the debate over who killed him, the ultimate fate of Susanna Alderdice, and how Buffalo Bill Cody would eventually bring this story to stages around the world in his Wild West shows. But for tonight, the many tales surrounding the terrible history of the Battle of Summit Springs are other stories for other times. Eastern Colorado, July 11, 1869. As an entire Cheyenne village erupts in chaos, with men, women, and children stampeding in all directions, Captain Sylvanus E. Cushing leads a company of men from the U.S. Army's 5th Cavalry into the middle of the fray. With his pistol drawn, he makes his way towards a large teepee in the middle of the village whose door has been left open. Just as he reaches the lodge, a young white woman suddenly appears, clearly injured and covered in blood. Only minutes ago, she had been cruelly shot in the back by her Cheyenne captors and left for dead. But she has survived. Still, she is obviously terrified and, understandably, disoriented. But at first sight of Captain Cushing, she frantically crawls towards him, desperately crying out for help in German, which Cushing does not understand. The horrified Cushing rushes towards the young woman and realizes that she is one of the Cheyenne captives that he and his men have been sent here to rescue. He makes his way towards her and assures her that she is now safe, all while doing his best to assess the wound to her back. He asks the woman for her name, and she replies that she is Maria Weichel, one of the 2 missing women that the army has been searching for. As gunshots, war cries, and the shrieks of the wounded Cheyenne fill the air, Captain Cushing rushes Maria Weichel back to the Army field hospital that has been set up to care for the wounded. Even for the experienced field surgeon of the 5th Cavalry, she is a shocking sight, having been held captive by the Cheyenne for the previous 6 weeks. While she is being cared for, Cushing and the other officers question her as to the whereabouts of the other woman being held captive in this village, the pregnant 24-year-old Susanna Alderdice. Weichel responds that Alderdice is somewhere in the village, but she does not know where. Back in the village, Thomas Alderdice, Susanna's husband, frantically searches every lodge that he can find, hoping to find his missing wife and save any last vestiges that he has of his family. 6 weeks before, all of his children, save for his 4-year-old stepson Willis and infant daughter Alice, had been cut down by Tall Bull and his band of dog soldiers as they raided the homesteads along the Saline River. Since that day, Thomas Alderdice has doggedly pursued the Cheyenne and endured endless attempts by local army officers to deny providing him any kind of military assistance. Finally, General Christopher C. Auger had ordered Major General Eugene Carr to pursue Tall Bull's band of warriors and their families. Now, in the midst of the din of battle, Thomas Alderdice strains his eyes and his ears for any sign of his beloved wife. But there is still no sign of Susanna Alderdice. Meanwhile, Tall Bull has ordered his people to coalesce in a nearby ravine, where he and his dog soldiers plan to fight to the death in order to protect their wives and children. All of the warriors have unfurled links of rope or sashes that hang from their right shoulders and driven their long lances through them, pinning themselves to the ground. Though the Cheyenne tribe boasts a number of warrior societies, including the Elkhorn Scraper Society, the Tik-Tok Society, the Red Shield Society, and the Bowstring Society, it is the dog soldiers who are perhaps the most well-known of all. They are known for being aggressive, almost to the point of recklessness, and are charged with fighting to the death, even to the point of tethering themselves to the earth in order to show their enemies that there would be no retreat. Among the Cheyenne, it is believed that in the 1830s, as cholera and smallpox tore through their tribe, a revered mystic and medicine man by the name of Sweet Medicine had ventured into the Black Hills on a vision quest. He had remained for 4 long years, before returning from the mountains as if he were some kind of high plains mosaic figure with a proverbial list of edicts and prescriptions that he believed would protect and preserve his people. He had founded the 4 original societies in the Elkhorn Scrapers, the Tik-Toks, the Red Shields, and the Bowstring Society. The Dog Soldiers would be added later as a 5th society, but the lore of the Dog Soldiers' origins go much deeper than this. The story holds that, after failing to find a home in any of the 4 available warrior societies, a dejected young warrior had sought to found his own society. After being prayed over by Sweet Medicine, he had ventured out onto the plains on a vision quest of his own. Days later, he returned to the village, but now he was not alone. With him were dozens of warriors, none of whom anyone in the village had seen before. They all sported the unique feathered headdresses that would become the trademark of the dog soldiers, and they spoke not a word to anyone in the village. Regardless of the veracity of this story, the dog soldiers would indeed go on to form not only their own warrior society, but eventually their own tribal band. By this time in 1869, the dog soldiers are well known and much feared throughout the whole of the northern and central plains. They are highly skilled, highly aggressive, and absolutely ruthless warriors and raiders. And, to be sure, this is a known fact to every officer and enlisted man now charging into the ravine in pursuit of Tall Bull and his people. Even though they have managed to catch these warriors and their families off guard, the battle that now unfolds is a hard-fought, bloody affair, with the screams of women and children being drowned out only by the din of gunfire. The soldiers managed to stampede most of the Cheyennes' horses, scattering the animals onto the plains and cutting off a critical means of escape for the Cheyenne. As the battle unfolds, the young dog soldier by the name of Wolf with Plenty of Hair, himself tethered to the ground by his dog rope, fights for his very life as the cavalry slams into the Cheyenne line at the head of the ravine. Though most of the men now slashing and shooting their way through the Cheyenne lines are American soldiers, perhaps the most enthusiastic among them are the Pawnee Scouts, who fall upon the dog soldiers and the women and children alike with their full fury. The Cheyenne and the Pawnee are longtime enemies, and, as is often the case in frontier warfare, many Pawnee warriors have volunteered as scouts expressly with the hope of being able to track down and kill their generational foes, all while being backed by the full might of the United States Army. Chief Tall Bull, for his part, puts up a ferocious fight defending his wives and directing his warriors. In total, he has 3 wives, and while he has managed to send one of them away on a horse, he knows full well that should he fall, his remaining 2 wives will likely be killed as well. And so, the vicious fight in the ravine carries on, with every man amongst the Cheyenne fighting with a marked ferocity in order to defend their families. As dust fills the ravine, the remainder of the surviving Cheyenne are attempting to flee onto the open prairies. They have coalesced into small groups, making them easy targets for the Pawnee Scouts that choose to pursue them rather than joining the fight in the ravine. 3 of the warriors attempting to usher their families away now rush to place themselves between the attacking Pawnee and the escaping Cheyenne. These warriors are Kills Mini Bears, 2 Crows, and Lone Bear. Among them, Lone Bear is the only one who still has his horse. He now repeatedly charges towards the Pawnee, as Kills Mini Bears and 2 Crows provide covering fire and direct the women and children to hurry forward. Finally, though, one of these courageous charges results in Lone Bear being unhorsed and ruthlessly killed by the Pawnee Scouts. The scene that unfolds now is apocalyptic, with wounded, dead, and dying Cheyenne strewn about the ground in all directions. Many of the dog soldiers in the ravine see their families cut down right in front of them. Tall Bull himself sees his youngest wife killed early on in the engagement. Ironically, the one American who can perhaps most empathize with the current plight of these dog soldiers is Thomas Alderdice himself, the man whose family they had so cruelly cut down 6 weeks ago, and whose wife they have since abused and held prisoner. In those preceding weeks, Thomas Alderdice has buried his children, cared for his 4-year-old stepson Willis, who had been shot full of dog soldier arrows, and found the body of his infant daughter, who had been taken prisoner along with his pregnant wife, callously hung from the branches of a tree. Now, back in the Cheyenne village, he frantically searches from lodge to lodge, searching for any sign of Susanna. But, much to his dismay, he finds none. He knows that she must be here, but he does not know where. After all of the heartache and travails of the previous month and a half, he finds himself nearly overcome by grief and exhaustion. But still, he continues his search. Back at the ravine, the Cheyenne continue to fall in what has become a veritable high plains house of horrors. Blood now soaks into the dirt, forming small, macabre pools of sanguine mud. The young dog soldier Wolf with Plenty of Hair now lies dead upon the ground, his slumping body pulling taut the dog rope that ties him to his lance. Eventually, Tall Bull himself is finally shot and killed, though the accounts of exactly who killed him vary. Buffalo Bill Cody himself claimed that it was he who fired the shot that finally brought down Tall Bull. In fact, years later, Cody would include an entire segment portraying the battle, including his supposed slaying of Tall Bull, in his world-famous Wild West shows. But several other accounts dispute Cody's version of the events. One of these is the account of Captain Frank North, one of the officers who led the charge into the ravine. North claimed that it was him who had, in fact, slain Tall Bull. But further examination of his claims also leaves more questions than answers. Firstly, in his journal entry for the date of the battle, North wrote only that, quote, "Marched this morn at 6 a.m., and with 50 of my men and 200 whites with 3 days' rations. Followed trail until 3 p.m., and came to the village. Made a grand charge, and it was a complete victory. Took the whole village, about 85 lodges, killed about 60 Indians, took 17 prisoners, and had about 300 ponies and robes, etc. Rained pretty hard that night." End quote. Though certainly a valuable first-hand account, the entry makes no mention of Tall Bull at all, much less any mention of North being the man to deal him his fatal blow. For their part, the Pawnee Scouts state that they did not see who killed Tall Bull. In any event, the legendary dog soldier will not be the only Cheyenne to fall on this day in the ravine. By the end of the fighting in the ravine, only one Cheyenne, a woman, Tall Bull's youngest wife, Sundance Woman, would be left alive. Sobbing, and by now severely traumatized, she is grouped with the other prisoners and held under guard by the men of the 5th Cavalry. The final heart-wrenching addition to this group of Cheyenne prisoners comes by way of an orphaned 4-year-old boy who is spotted wandering around at the base of a bluff near the ravine. But this has indeed been a major victory for the United States Army and for Major General Eugene Carr. It has also been a devastating defeat for the Cheyenne, who have, in the course of only a few hours, gone from enjoying their noontime meal to seeing their entire lives destroyed. Soon after the battle, in what seems like one last providential blow to the surviving Cheyenne, a sizable thunderstorm drenches the area for several hours, turning the already blood-soaked ground into a sickening morass of mud and viscera. Captain Frank North scouts the battlefield after the fight in the ravine and notices a curious lump on the ground several yards away. Riding closer, he sees that this is, in fact, the deceased body of Susanna Alderdice. She has been struck severely on the forehead by a Cheyenne war club and also bears a bullet wound just above her left eye. In later accounts of the battle, Sundance Woman herself stated that it was Tall Bull who had kept Susanna as a prisoner and that it was Tall Bull who had ultimately killed her. The tragic life of Susanna Alderdice has, after 6 weeks of torturous captivity, ended here, in the middle of nowhere, far from her home and family. A detachment of soldiers is brought out to retrieve her body and bring her to the field hospital. Here, the surgeon who had treated Maria Weichel solemnly prepares the body for burial by wrapping her in a buffalo robe. After the distraught Thomas Alderdice is informed of the news, a wave of grief that has become all too familiar to him in the last month and a half again washes over him, nearly sending him to his knees on the hard prairie ground. He attends his beloved wife's funeral, where she is laid to rest not far from the site of the battle. Even for the battle-hardened troops of the 5th Cavalry, the sight of Susanna Alderdice being laid to rest with her grieving husband standing over the grave is one that moves many of them deeply. According to one observer's account of the ceremony, quote, "The cavalry sounded the funeral dirge, and, as the soft, mournful notes died away, many a cheek was wet that had long been a stranger to tears." However, immediately after the funeral rites have been completed, the soldiers turn their ire back towards the Cheyenne village. The empty wreckage and dead bodies now strewn about the ground are carefully combed through for both evidence and for loot. In one of these lodges, after finding a number of tomahawks, arrows, and blankets, one of the soldiers finds a necklace made out of human fingers. The grisly trophy is carefully examined and found to hold a finger with a ring of untanned skin encircling it, indicative of having worn a wedding ring. Upon further inspection of the lodge, a wedding ring is indeed found, and then brought back to the army camp. Here, Maria Weichel identifies it as the wedding band of her husband, George. Once all of the usable evidence and goods have been retrieved, the soldiers set the village on fire, going from lodge to lodge with torches and burning every structure to the ground. With the flames still roaring behind them, Major General Carr leads the entire contingent of soldiers, scouts, and prisoners, along with the mourning Thomas Alderdice and Maria Weichel, away from the village and back towards Fort Sedgwick. In a final haunting, tragic scene, the dogs of the Cheyenne, many of whom have gathered on a nearby ridge, send out mournful howls that seem to hang in the thick, wet air as they watch their owners disappear forever. Once the dogs can no longer be heard, the soldiers, civilians, and prisoners carry on with the 65-mile trek to Fort Sedgwick. They would arrive at the fort 2 days later, on July 14th. Here, Major General Carr makes his report to the commanding officer, Brigadier General George D. Ruggles. This report soon spreads to local Kansas papers, and then, within a week, to the front page of the New York Times. Meanwhile, back at Fort Sedgwick, Major General Carr and the 5th Cavalry receive orders to move to Fort McPherson, roughly 400 miles to the east, near Wichita, Kansas. However, before they depart, nearly every man among them personally bids farewell and warm wishes to Maria Weichel, who is now slowly but surely recovering from her wounds and nearing the impending birth of her baby. But just as Major General Carr is about to depart with his men, he receives tragic news of his own. As his men are assembling, a messenger rides into camp carrying a letter informing Carr that his 5-month-old son has passed away. Now, dealing with the loss of his own child, the heartbroken Carr is formally relieved of his duties and sent with a security detachment back to his home in St. Louis, Missouri. The 5th Cavalry, however, now led by Colonel William B. Royal, will carry on with its mission. Though the Battle of Summit Springs has been a resounding victory for the Army, the war on the plains is by no means over, and thus the fighting will carry on for years to come. For her part, Maria Weichel will be sent to Omaha, Nebraska, along with the Cheyenne prisoners, where 2 months later she will give birth to a healthy baby girl. She will even go on to find love again, remarrying to a man named Joseph Mance. As for the Cheyenne, the Battle of Summit Springs would prove to be the beginning of the end of their way of life on the plains. The defeat in the ravine that day would cause the Cheyenne to forevermore avoid the area, never again making camp anywhere near the site of the battle. As case in point for how traumatized they were as a people by this vicious ambush, the Cheyenne, in a move that is almost unheard of within their culture, refused to return to the area to bury their dead. For a full 2 months, the bodies of the fallen Cheyenne are left exposed to the elements and to local predators, lying where they had fallen. Finally, a group of Lakota warriors, close allies of the Cheyenne, volunteered to travel to the battle site in order to carry out the unenviable but important task of providing the dead with a proper burial. After the battle, most of the surviving dog soldiers had moved to the north. While a small number remained in the area, over the succeeding months they would begin to trickle into Fort Supply in small groups in order to surrender to the soldiers. Though it would be roughly a decade before the Cheyenne surrendered in full, the coming years will hold much frustration, grief, and desperation for both the Cheyenne and the dog soldiers. But perhaps no one was as affected by the battle as Thomas Alderdice. He had lost his wife and unborn child, his infant daughter, and all of his sons and stepsons save for 4-year-old Willis Daly. Still, Thomas would go on to remarry and have several more children. And Willis would go on to start a family of his own and become a beloved local citizen of Blue Rapids, Kansas. However, he would walk with a limp for the rest of his life and bore the scars of dog soldier arrows and bullets until the day that he passed away in 1920. Thomas Alderdice would move to Clinton County, Iowa soon after the battle, and even move back to Kansas with his family, but he refused to visit the site of the massacre on the Saline River. It would not be until 1911, 42 years after the dog soldiers attacked his family, before Thomas Alderdice would return in search of the graves of his son Frank and stepson John. But tragically, he was not able to find them, and, dejected, he would leave Saline Springs forever. Thomas Alderdice would live to the age of 84, finally passing away in Conway Springs, Kansas in 1925. The events of the Battle of Summit Springs would go on to change the Old West forever. It would, in many ways, spell the end of an era on the open plains. It would also change countless lives, ruin countless families, and lead to decades of turmoil and regret on both sides. But the many tales of the tragedy, violence, and brutality on the plains of Kansas and Colorado are, for tonight, other stories for other times. Southwestern Colorado, January 15, 1865. Near the frozen banks of Dead Man's Creek, 2 local cowboys scour the ground for usable firewood. Their horses' breath hangs heavy in the air, and their fingers ache from the cold. Gus Hall and another man known only as Big Steve have been sent out in the cold to gather more firewood by their boss, a popular local rancher named William Morris. As the duo decides to move across the frozen river and make their way back to the ranch with their haul of firewood, they are greeted with a truly horrifying sight. A large band of Cheyenne warriors converging at the top of a hill that separates the cowboys from their ranch. Upon spotting the 2 men, the Cheyenne have split their forces, sending half of their warriors to attack the ranch, and the other half to cut off and eliminate Hall and Big Steve. Meanwhile, back at Morris's ranch, known as the American Ranch, a few of the other ranch hands and their families are gathered inside the back of the main cabin, listening to William Morris as he saws away at his fiddle and pensively waits for the return of his men. As he plays, the women and children enjoy the warm reprieve from the unrelenting Colorado winter outside. Suddenly, amidst the mournful wails of Mr. Morris's fiddle, Mrs. Morris insists that she hears a noise coming from the front room of the cabin. The fiddle immediately falls silent, as William Morris now resolutely stands and grabs his pistol, suspecting that this noise is not simply his comrades returning with more firewood. His suspicions are confirmed as he opens the door separating the 2 rooms to find the front room of the cabin full of Cheyenne warriors. For a rancher in 1860s Colorado, there is perhaps no sight more terrifying than this. The Cheyenne, the mighty rulers of central Colorado for many generations, do not take kindly to the increasing incursions by the American settlers, farmers, and ranchers. This effrontery is one that is equally applied by the Cheyenne for any and all intruders into their territory, be they white settlers or other tribes. They have wrested control of this area from all challengers throughout many years of intensive, brutal conflict and combat unfettered by the cultural norms of Western conflict. In Cheyenne raiding and warfare, as is the case throughout many of the Plains tribes, non-combatants are generally considered viable targets, and victory is attained only through utter capitulation or complete destruction. In years prior, countless settlers across Colorado have fallen victim to Cheyenne raiding, seeing entire families wiped out, men brutally tortured and mutilated before being dispatched, and wives and children simply carried off onto the plains, never to be seen again. These facts are all too well known to Mr. Morris, as he has made himself ready for such an occasion as this by keeping his revolver cleaned, loaded, and nearby at all times. Now, seeing his home full of Cheyenne warriors, he brings the weapon to bear and fires 3 decisive shots into the warriors nearest him. These men all fall to the cabin's floor, dead or dying, and the remainder of their comrades hurriedly exit the cabin, jumping onto their horses and riding for the cover of a nearby tree line. But they are not finished. The killing of 3 of their own warriors has only steeled the resolve of the Cheyenne, who are now dead set on retribution. Meanwhile, back at the cabin, Mr. Morris seizes this opportunity to barricade the front door shut and calm the nerves of the women and children who are visibly rattled by the sight of 3 dead Cheyenne warriors festooned about the room. All among them now mill nervously about the cabin, doing their best to fortify the windows and doors and to fight back the fear of the next attack, which is all but certain to come. As all of this is unfolding, the 2 ranch hands, Gus Hall and Big Steve, are now in a desperate fight for their lives, as they make a desperate bid to outpace the Cheyenne pursuers on their way back to the ranch. They are, however, quickly overtaken by the warriors, who manage to cut them off before reaching the hill. Big Steve is soon hit in the chest and killed, and Hall is shot in the leg, falling from his horse. He hits the ground hard, then tries desperately to scramble to his feet. Hearing a warrior quickly approaching, he manages to bring himself to his feet, but is quickly struck down again by an arrow to his side. Now, as he lies on the ground rendered immobile by his wounds, he is shocked to find that his pursuers have simply passed him by and continued on over the hill. At first, in his state of shock, Hall finds this a confusing move on the part of the Cheyenne. He briefly wonders what could motivate such odd behavior amongst the warriors who, normally, would be so resolute on not only killing himself and his companion, but in harvesting their scalps as well. Then, in a horrifying realization, the Cheyennes' motives become clear. They are now converging with their cohorts over the hill to mount a full-scale attack on the farmstead and the cabin. Hall now manages to drag himself the several yards to the top of the hill and look down in horror. But the Cheyenne have decided not to mount a full-scale attack. Not yet. Instead, in a time-honored plains warfare tactic, they are now setting fire to the stables, to the hay barn, and to the roof of the cabin. In his current state, Hall, knowing full well that the inhabitants of the cabin are mostly women and children, can do nothing more but watch on, as the horrifying events that follow unfold. Soon, fires are raging all about the ranch, sending a large, converging cloud of thick smoke into the thin, cold January air. Inside the cabin, panic has taken hold, as smoke begins to pour in underneath the door, and the painted faces of Cheyenne warriors appear in every window. They are now trapped, surrounded, thoroughly outmanned, and thoroughly outgunned. Moving quickly with the lives of his family in the balance, William Morris resolutely takes out a bottle of strychnine poisoning that he uses on the wolves who attack his cattle. He walks over to the kitchen and retrieves 2 bottles of whiskey he keeps in the cupboards. With the smoke inside the cabin growing thicker by the second, and the panicked cries of those around him growing even louder, Morris carefully divides the poison between the 2 bottles, shaking the contents well to ensure that they mix. He knows that the Cheyenne will soon overtake the cabin, and that whiskey is prized amongst nearly every warrior. If he cannot eliminate them now with bullets, he reasons, he can eliminate them later via a slow, painful death through poisoning. He then instructs Mrs. Morris to lead the women and children out the front door and surrender themselves to the Cheyenne. However horrifying, this is likely their best chance of survival. Cheyenne raiding parties, for all their legendary ferocity, rarely strike down women and children who surrender themselves, preferring instead to take them captive and either use them as slave labor or adopt them into the tribe. However, William Morris knows that he will be afforded no such mercy. The Cheyenne know that he is the man responsible for killing 3 of their comrades, and, even if he had not, men on the frontier are almost always killed or tortured to horrific ends. Mr. and Mrs. Morris now bid each other a brief, tearful goodbye, each likely knowing that this will be the last time that they see each other. This reprieve is only moments long, though, as the Cheyenne begin to break down the door. Mrs. Morris now flings it open, arms raised in surrender, and herself and the other women are then led outside, amidst a terrifying cacophony of Cheyenne war cries. As they are surrounded, beaten, and restrained, William Morris makes a dash out the back door, pistol in hand. Knowing that his only chance to save his family lies in his ability to make it to the cover of the nearby tree line, Morris sprints as fast as he can, his vision and breathing hampered by the smoke that engulfs the entirety of his homestead. Sadly, though, his efforts are in vain, as he is cut down mere yards from the cabin by Cheyenne bullets and arrows. He falls hard to the cold ground with a sickening thud, and within seconds he is scalped and mutilated. Just around the corner of the cabin, Mrs. Morris hears the triumphant war cries of the warriors pursuing her husband, and knows it can mean only one thing. Already distraught, she now hangs her head and sobs heavily as the Cheyenne tie her hands and load her onto the back of one of the horses. Meanwhile, at the top of the hill overlooking the ranch, Gus Hall has watched the entire event unfold in silent horror, mouth agape and with a torturous guilt consuming him because he is not able to come to his friend's aid. As the Cheyenne ride away, with their distraught captives in tow, and the buildings of the ranch burning, Hall now considers his options. He can either lie here and surrender his life to the elements, or he must somehow garner the will to begin the agonizing crawl to the nearest ranch, which lies just over 2 miles away. After a short internal deliberation, Hall decides that he simply cannot lie here and die. He must, he reasons, at least attempt to make it to the next ranch and alert them that his friends have been taken captive. And so, for the next 17 hours, Hall crawls inch by inch towards the neighboring ranch, known as the Wisconsin Ranch, owned by Holland Godfrey. After his harrowing trek, Hall finally nears the top of the hill that overlooks the Wisconsin Ranch. Nearing the very limits of his endurance, he finally reaches the top of the hill and is able to look down at the ranch below him. What he sees horrifies him. With a sickening sense of déjà vu, Hall sees the burned-out remnants of the ranch house that Holland Godfrey and his family call home. Now, Hall can only assume they are all either dead or have been taken captive themselves. Hall now lies in the snow, nearly overcome with despair and with the biting evening cold beginning to set in. He decides that his best option now is to seek shelter for the night in one of the charred remains of the Godfrey's barn. He now begins another arduous crawl down the hill and racing against the setting sun. Finally, he reaches the homestead and manages to curl up behind a few of the barn's timbered planks which have survived the fire. Shivering and suffering from blood loss and shock, Hall endures another freezing Colorado night made only slightly more bearable by his ramshackle structure. But what Hall does not know is that Holland Godfrey and his family have managed to actually survive the Cheyenne raiding party's attack. Only hours before Hall had managed to reach the top of the nearby hill, the Cheyenne had made their attack on the Godfreys' homestead. They had stormed the family's property, but, much to their surprise, found that Hole and Godfrey had fortified his home not only with a 6-foot adobe wall that surrounded his cabin, as well as the yard in front of it and the family's water well, but he had also installed portholes into both walls of the cabin and into the adobe wall. He had also amassed a sizable cache of weapons, ammunition, food, and water. The initial attack had come early in the morning, just as the sun began to peek over the eastern mountains. Godfrey's hired ranch hands were also on site, and as the Cheyenne made their approach, the men armed themselves and made their way to the portholes. As they steadied their arms, the women and children made their way to the back room and securely barricaded the door. Reverting to their time-honored tactic, the Cheyenne had then ridden to the barn and set fire to the haystacks inside. A strong wind soon whipped the blaze into a fury, and within a few minutes the barn and stables were on fire as well. This had driven all the livestock away from the homestead grounds. Seeing this, Godfrey's wife, Matilda Godfrey, had gathered the older children into a line and then climbed atop the roof herself. From here, she directed them to dunk buckets of water into the well, which were then passed along much like a fire brigade. Matilda then took the buckets and used the water to douse the roof, as the men manning the portholes provided covering fire. This process went on for almost the entirety of the day, with the harrowing effects of all involved spelling the difference between life and death at the hands of the Cheyenne. When night finally fell, the Cheyenne, having had their fill of combat for the day, had finally retired, riding over the hills and out of sight, leaving the Godfrey family shaken but alive. But all of them knew that someone must now make their way to the nearest army outpost at Junction Stage Station, a 30-mile ride away. As the moon now began to light the surrounding landscape, it was Eli Perkins, one of Godfrey's ranch hands, who volunteered for the perilous task. Knowing full well that the Cheyenne may still be swarming about the area, Perkins had bade his friends and employer farewell and rode into the dark, the hopes of all of their survival weighing on his shoulders. Just before 11 o'clock that evening, he had arrived at Junction Station Stage and reported the events of the day to the officer in charge. The following morning, after an uneasy, sleepless night, the Godfreys let out a collective cry of joy and relief as they spotted Eli Perkins riding back to the ranch in the company of several dozen cavalry troops. Their lives had been saved, but for their own safety, they were informed that they would be required to accompany the troops back to their headquarters until the attacks in the area finally stopped. This they had readily done, riding away from their intact home and the burned-out skeleton of their ranch. Only hours after this, Gus Hall had come upon the smoldering ruins of the barn and, assuming the family to be laid out in a gory scene inside the cabin, he had simply curled up inside the crumbling structure and fallen asleep in total exhaustion. Now, as the day drags into the afternoon, a wagon train of settlers making their way through Colorado comes upon the horrifying scene and stops to examine it in detail. But they too find the ranch empty. However, just as they are about to leave, one of the men amongst them spies Hall inside the barn. He calls out to his comrades that he has indeed found a dead man. But this noise stirs Hall awake, and he informs the man that he is, quote, "not dead yet, but I think I will be before long." The settlers load the ailing Hall into one of their wagons and bring him to the nearest doctor. Hall does in fact manage to recover, though his leg must be amputated. The Godfrey family will remain at the Army headquarters for a few days before making their way back to reclaim and rebuild their ranch. While at the headquarters, Hole and Godfrey learns that word has come back from scouts in the area that the Cheyenne have begun referring to the Godfrey homestead as, quote, Old Fort Wicked. Taking a gleeful amount of pride in this label, Godfrey, upon returning to his ranch, erects a wooden sign that reads, Old Fort Wicked. Though it is unlikely that many of his local enemies are literate in the English language, he unapologetically takes immense pleasure in the sign. Weeks later, the burned-out wreckage of the Morris farm will be combed over by another cavalry detachment. They find the body of William Morris, scalped and mutilated where he had fallen. They do their best to provide him with a proper burial, and then, with no further ceremony, simply ride out again, heading back to the Junction Stage Station. However tragic, this scene has and will be repeated countless times in Colorado history. To those soldiers, ranch hands, and families who called this wild land home, the attacks on the Morris and Godfrey ranches will ultimately be seen as just a part of life on the frontier, one to be borne with as much stoicism and acceptance as the seasons or the local grizzly bears. However, this was not the common narrative in many of the larger cities. On January 14, 1865, just one day before the attacks on the Morris and Godfrey families, a local newspaper from the town of Central City, located some 30 miles west of Denver, ran the following article, decrying the exaggerated nature of violence on the Colorado frontier. Quote, "We have been favored by Captain Jones with the perusal of a letter from his sister, Mrs. Clayton from Denver, who started a few days since to go to the South Platte River by coach, but after laying at Valley Station for several days, was compelled to return to Denver. She says, quote, parties who have returned from the scene of a recent fight say there were only 75 to 100 Indians engaged in the fight, and that instead of 12 or 20 being killed as reported, only 4 were actually killed, the rest having since come into the various ranches along the route. She thinks that the coaches might pass through without difficulty, and says the whole account of the troubles have been greatly exaggerated. She is not very complimentary to the military here." End quote. Such was the divide between those who knew the frontier and those who lived on it. The open expanses and Rocky Mountain valleys of Colorado have, without question, played host to some of the most blood-curdling, bone-chillingly violent events in the history of the Old West. But the stories of those battles, massacres, and outright murders are, for tonight, other stories for other times. Northeastern Colorado, 1852. As the morning sun begins to burn the dew off the prairie grass that surrounds them, 2 Cheyenne war chiefs prepare to make an attack on a village of their hated enemy, the Pawnee. One man, the war chief named Black Kettle, carries a bundle of arrows, blessed by a Cheyenne medicine man and tied to the end of his long lance. The other, a man named Long Chin, wears the sacred medicine hat, also blessed by a medicine man. These items are not only of great spiritual importance to their tribe, they believe they are critical elements in surviving and winning the fight that is soon to come. In the tradition of the Cheyenne, no attack must be made until the men carrying these sacred items first take to the field. If this happens, they believe their attack could be compromised, and they could very well all likely be killed. In fact, the war between the Pawnee and the Cheyenne has been greatly flamed in the past decade after an 1842 battle in which the Pawnee had captured the bundle of sacred arrows. This defeat was seen as an unimaginable, nearly irreparable tragedy by the Cheyenne. Though one of the arrows would eventually be recaptured by their Lakota allies, the Cheyenne had spent much of the 1840s in a state of societal disarray, seemingly afflicted by all manner of tragedies. They had used the single recaptured arrow in a ceremony to make another bundle of sacred arrows, even trekking deep into the Black Hills in order to place 2 of the arrows deep within a crevice, in the hopes that this offering might rekindle some of their medicine. But at first, this had largely seemed like it had been to no avail, as tragedy continued to plague the Cheyenne people. In 1849, as thousands of Americans flooded through the area on their way to California in order to capitalize on the ongoing gold rush, thousands of Plains Tribes people became infected with deadly cholera. The Cheyenne and their Lakota allies' territory were those closest to the gold rush pioneers' main route of travel. Thus, they were even more exposed to the epidemic than many of their Plains tribes' counterparts. The resulting few years have proven devastating to both tribes, as countless thousands have succumbed to the disease, perishing in horrific circumstances, leaving countless orphans, widows, and widowers in their wake. Time and again, travelers would report entire Cheyenne villages completely deserted, with most of their inhabitants having been lost to cholera, and the rest having fled to the hills in a desperate attempt to escape the mysterious, unseen plague that was seemingly wiping their people from the earth. However, in the last few years, the Cheyenne have begun to rise to power again. Black Kettle and his family had managed to survive the epidemic, and his leadership and selflessness had driven his rise to prominence amongst his people. He had earned his reputation not only through his deeds in battle, but his foresight and his prudence. In 1850, he had moved his people to the Arkansas River and sent the call out for any and all surviving Cheyenne bands to join him and his people so that they might be strengthened in their numbers and begin to rebuild their people. In 1851, he had participated in the signing of the Treaty of Fort Laramie, which solidified a truce between the Cheyenne and their close ally the Arapaho and the U.S. government. In return for what amounted to a lease on the Cheyenne's buffalo hunting grounds, the U.S. government would cede control of the lands ranging from the Rocky Mountains to the plains lying roughly 300 miles to the east. Bolstered by this official recognition, Black Kettle had arranged an alliance between the Cheyenne and not only their longtime allies in the Arapaho and the Lakota, but with the Kiowa and the Apache as well. They had then taken to the warpath against the Pawnee in the summer of 1852, wreaking havoc on their mutual enemy and attempting to drive them out of this territory for good. But despite the success of their campaign, the Pawnee have, as of yet, still not been driven from what the Cheyenne hold to be their rightful territory. And thus, the Cheyenne warriors now gathered around Black Kettle still burned for vengeance and glory against their hated enemy. The warriors, in keeping with the Cheyenne tradition, are all dressed and ready for battle, and all atop horses painted with specific, personalized patterns, also intended to bring them fortune and favor in the battle to come. But several of the Cheyenne warriors are missing. Most notably among them, another war chief by the name of Big Head. But, with time now of the utmost essence, the two chiefs now lead their forces out of their encampment and over the nearby hills, towards the Pawnee village their scouts have discovered only a few days prior. As they reach the village, Black Kettle checks the sinew tether which attaches the medicine arrows to his lance. He breathes a sigh of relief, assured they are snugly in place. He then looks at the faces of the men around him, many of them likely lost in the memories of past conflicts with the Pawnee and in the retribution they seek to gain. Though they are already willing and capable warriors, the absence of several of their men, as well as the war chief Big Head, begins to weigh on him more and more heavily. With every passing mile in their approach to their target, the missing Cheyenne warriors become a growing concern. Had they abandoned their kinsmen? Had they simply chosen not to heed the call of battle? Or, perhaps the worst option, were they acting preemptively and attacking the Pawnee village already? If this was in fact the case, not only would the Cheyenne's element of surprise be lost, but the power of their medicine would be destroyed. Black Kettle and Long Chin, however, push these thoughts away and continue on their quiet, doggedly deliberate ride approaching the Pawnee. Finally, they reach the hill that overlooks the Pawnee village, and, looking down upon it, they are shocked by what they see. While there are many lodges, fire pits, and even drying buffalo hides all about the site, there are, seemingly, no Pawnee. This is undoubtedly an unsettling development for all, perhaps most so for the war chiefs in charge of the medicine. For all of them, the situation at hand now poses two immediate questions. One, if the Pawnee are not here in their village, where are they? And two, have the warriors missing from their own party waged a preemptive attack, driving the Pawnee into the hills and breaking the power of the Cheyenne's medicine? Black Kettle and his cohorts do not have time to wait long for their answers to these questions. Within a few minutes, the missing war chief, Big Head, and his warriors are seen riding towards them. As they near Black Kettle and Long Chin's position, the two chiefs are horrified to realize that Big Head is, in fact, holding a freshly taken scalp, still dripping wet with gore. Though normally this would be an occasion for great celebration amongst the Cheyenne, in this situation it means only one painfully obvious thing. There has indeed been a preemptive attack on the Pawnee, perpetrated by Big Head and his followers. Now, their medicine has been broken, and the protection they believe it affords them has been greatly compromised. But now it is too late to call off the attack, as these warriors have traveled far to claim their trophies and glory. Amongst them, retreat will not be seen as prudence, but cowardice. Thus, Black Kettle, Long Chin, and the warriors under their command now follow Big Head as he leads them towards the site where the Pawnee have retreated to. For his part, Big Head is now all but certain that victory will be assured, and the Pawnee have been weakened from the initial attack. However, after a short ride over the nearby hilltop, he is quickly proven wrong. In his force's brief absence, the Pawnee have hurriedly dug out firing pits from which to hunker down and defend their position from the Cheyenne charges. Now, what was supposed to be a surprise attack in the early hours of the dawn has turned into facing down an entrenched enemy position under the sweltering afternoon sun. With no other option, the Cheyenne, their forces now united, spend the following hours making head-on charge after head-on charge, attempting to break the Pawnee's defenses. But, time and again, they are repeatedly beaten back by the Pawnee bullets and arrows. As the battle unfolds, several Cheyenne warriors retreat to the original site of the Pawnee village, setting fire to all of the lodges in order to deny the Pawnee any shelter or foodstuffs should any of them survive this day. But, as they are carrying out this task, one of the Cheyenne warriors suddenly spots a large group of native riders approaching, coming directly towards them. At first, they are unable to identify them. Then, suddenly, as the party rides to within 100 yards, they are able to ascertain that this group is, in fact, composed of warriors from the Potawatomi tribe, an ally of the Pawnee. Coming to the aid of the Pawnee, this party shoots down several of the Cheyenne, setting fire to the village, before hurriedly riding on, following the Cheyenne trail to their current position. They flank the Cheyenne's position, taking them by surprise and driving them from the field of battle, killing several more of the Cheyenne in the process. As the Cheyenne retreat, all among them, most notably Black Kettle and Long Chin, are rife with anger and resentment at the actions of Big Head. His vainglory has, they all believe, cost them the glory of victory and cost several of their warriors their lives. The Cheyenne camp, only hours before a place of great excitement and ballyhoo, now resounds with the wailing of newly widowed Cheyenne women who know that their husbands' bodies are, perhaps at this very moment, suffering the degradations and mutilations wrought upon all slain enemies in Plains warfare. To add insult to injury, it seems to many among them that their attempts to rekindle their sacred medicine have failed them yet again. Many direct their ire towards Big Head, while others find themselves simply lost in fear and sorrow. It seems that, yet again, the future of their people has been cast into uncertainty. But while this is not the end for the Cheyenne, nor the end for Chief Black Kettle, their struggles will continue on for decades. Throughout the 1850s, not only will conflict with the Pawnee continue, but the United States government will progressively do less and less in order to honor their agreement in the Fort Laramie Treaty. Despite continuous protests on behalf of the Cheyenne, American expansion into their territories will continue, reaching its peak in 1859 with the onset of Colorado's Pikes Peak Gold Rush. Many of the Cheyenne warrior societies would meet this expansion with continued brutal raiding on the encroaching settlers. However, Black Kettle, an ardent pragmatist, argued for a cessation to the violence and further cooperation with government officials. But his acquiescence would ultimately prove a pivotal element in what history views as likely his and his own people's greatest tragedy, the Sand Creek Massacre of 1861, in which federal troops, under the command of Colonel John Chivington, brutally attacked Black Kettle's village, killing the legendary chief and dozens of Cheyenne men, women, and children in the process. By many accounts, it is said that Black Kettle flew the American flag given to him on an official visit to Washington, D.C. outside of his teepee, in hopes that it would signal to the soldiers that his village was in fact allied with and allegiant to the United States. But this would prove to be to no avail, as Chivington's men carried out one of the most ruthless, inhumane actions in American military history. While the Cheyenne would be virtually decimated by this tragedy, their story would not end with the atrocities of Sand Creek. And while Black Kettle would ultimately meet his end there, being remembered as one of the most influential chiefs in the history of his people, the stories of his many exploits and efforts to sustain the life of his people are too numerous to cover in one sitting. And thus, the many stories of the Cheyenne people and their revered chief, Black Kettle, are, for tonight, other stories for other times. Thank you again for joining us on this episode of History at the OK Corral. Be sure to click the like button, share this episode with a friend, and become a subscriber. Also, if you'd like to support our work and gain early access to episodes as well as ad-free viewing, you can become a member of this channel by clicking on the join button down below. Also, be sure to follow us on TikTok and Instagram and subscribe to our newsletter. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you next time on History at the OK Corral, home of history's greatest shootouts and showdowns.